Hey Tim, good
How's
morning.
it going? Morning.
Thanks for getting up early for me.
All good?
Looks like your connection's still getting warmed up though.
Okay.
You're a little bit fuzzier than usual, but I think it's trying to lock in.
Haven't had a chance to put my face on.
So, yeah, yeah, we're recording already. Polycomputing.
Huh.
I was just looking
Yeah.
at a preprint that Mike Levin and Joshua Bongard
Mhm.
put up. There's plenty of room right here. Biological systems as evolved, overloaded, multi-scale machines. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
And I guess it's about a year and a half old now. But yeah, the idea of living systems performing multiple functions at the same time, at the same place, on the same substrate. In other words, like the same substrate, they say can simultaneously compute different things. And this polycomputing idea would be their attempt to generalize computation basically beyond just designed or technological systems so that computation can also become a way of thinking about the biological world. And I like that. I mean, it's a generalization of the function and of
Mhm.
function as we were talking about last time. But I guess the part of it that I haven't seen them get into yet would be that if we're going to generalize computation in this way to the living world, to organisms, there's something about function in the living world that it's not, organisms aren't just performing functions, right? Even the sorts of functions that Levin's describing that are polycomputations, same place, same time, multiple functions, like running over like
Mhm.
vibrations on a pond. Just they totally can do their thing without interfering. I mean, they do interfere sometimes, and I'm sure that's also the case with living systems. But
Yeah,
when they're
yeah. There's
functioning well,
amplification and interference. And, yeah.
right? But the thing about life is it's not just performing functions, it's producing new functions. And
Mm.
like as Stuart Kaufman would say, we can't pre-state all of the possible functions. Um, we can't even pre-state some small, I mean, they're infinite. Like, so there's just a, he would say it's uncomputable, it's computationally impossible. And so if we're, it makes me wonder if we're going to generalize computation, if we need a totally new conception of what computation is at that point, or what
Mhm.
information processing is at that point, that wouldn't just be limited to these sort of like prediction and control mechanisms, like a Bayesian process of some kind. Like, but and this gets into the free energy principle. If that's how organisms are being modeled as prediction and control machines, that to me seems to be an old model of computation. That if we really want to subsume the living world into that category, then we're going to need to expand what we mean by computations so that it also accounts for the production of new functions, which I don't think we can understand as just a random process. There seems to be some intelligence at work making selections that are right, not just the sort of passive selection that a simple, neo-Darwinian picture or a simple picture of just natural selection being purely, you know, organisms that happen to survive get selected differentially in an environment where they're competing for finite resources. If there's no, I mean, it seems clear that there is agency on the organism's part in selecting these functions that are nonetheless new functions that are nonetheless incalculable. Like there's a non-statistical form of judgment at play in Whitehead's terms, is what I
Mm.
would suggest here. So all that just by way of introducing the topic that you wanted to talk about. So if you want to reframe it in any way, but it seemed like an interesting challenge to me to this idea of polycomputing, that we really need to rethink what computation would mean in that case, because you can't pre-state all
Yeah.
the possible functions. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge to the use of some of these metaphors or maybe analogies. I mean, part of what I wanted to talk about, which we can get to, I think, is, you had in your participatory knowledge talk at the McGilchrist conference, you'd referenced some conceptual, resonance with Mike's talk of basically computation. And so there's a cool way of looking at this polycomputational stuff as a kind of perspectivalism, and also a kind of comparative methods epistemology almost, where and then this can get into the ontology in a nice way with this sort of constructive coarse graining notion, where you've basically got all of these agents that are working together, that like cells organized into a multicellular organism, and they are all taking slightly different perspectives on, whatever the desideratum might be. They're all coarse graining it in slightly different ways, i.e., they're all keying into slightly different properties or aspects of whatever it is there is a focus upon, and the sum of all of these different images. Don't necessarily want to jump into representational talk straight away, but that might be something we get to as well. But the sum of all of these different models, every word here has some sort of baggage associated with it, but is, it might be something like presentational immediacy in Whitehead's terms. Like there's a symbolic function of mapping these things, symbolic in Whitehead's terms, of mapping all of these different perspectives onto each other, and then what the organism as a whole perceives is this presentational immediacy that's somehow derived from all of these different perspectives. But in a sense, it can be it can be synthesized, and it can also be pulled apart. And there's this, I guess, constant process of integration and analysis, or analysis and integration, or whatever the thing is, being pulled apart, and there's more discreteness, and then being merged together, and these sort of higher level perspectives are emerging from that. So there's all of that. That's sort of part of what I wanted to talk about, and some resonances between that and the stuff you were talking about with participatory knowledge, and even things like Peircean notions of the community of inquirers and all of that. There are a lot of interesting overlaps there. And again, we are talking about this cusp of epistemology and ontology, and I think that's a very persistent sort of refrain in these talks, right? In these chats that we're having, and in the project that we're working on. Mm-hmm. But I think that the challenges that you bring up for any kind of computational or sort of information theoretic perspective on life itself those are the common challenges that people who from outside or who want to criticize the computational approach tend to bring up, I think. And we've talked about it a little bit in terms of with the free energy principle, and even with the steady state assumptions and that sort of stuff. It's like, okay, it's one thing to say that there are these attractors, that an organismal system is orbiting in a certain sense, and every time it's sort of perturbed and pushed away, it's being brought back into the orbit of that. And here we can readily think about things like homeostasis and allostasis, and just sort of phenotypic integrity and all of that sort of thing. So it's one thing to say that there are those sorts of functions, and it sounds pretty plausible, and it's a sort of standard dynamical systems way of thinking about an organism. But then there's this deeper question of where do the attractors come from? Or how does the organism deviate sufficiently from some particular set of attractors to, cross some, valley in a landscape, or peak in a landscape? Landscapes can be inverted. Fitness landscapes, we tend to think of hill climbing. With attractors, we tend to think of, descent functions, but whatever. How do they cross the fallow regions or whatever between attractor states or peaks or whatever? and we generate new phenotypes there. So how is it that organisms seem to be continually differentiating themselves from themselves, seem to be at odds with themselves, if indeed they can be fully described in these computational terms or these information theoretic terms? And I think, there are lots of ways of coming at that. And we've talked about some of these things previously. Simondon, who we brought up last time we chatted the other day, has a criticism of information theory that's he draws a lot from information theory, but his criticism of information theory would be that in order to get that off the ground, it requires, a sender and a receiver and a channel. And his question is always, because Simondon really wants to think individuation as fundamentally as possible. So he has issues with, say, like hylomorphic schemes and things, certainly has issue with more overtly Platonic, but he also has issues with Aristotelian accounts because he thinks that these things actually presuppose individuation. So, a hylomorphic account, there's this, pluripotent or, metastable matter, but there's a form that comes from outside and imbues that matter and individuates it. And his pretty obvious criticism is that, well, that form is pre-individuated then. The form has already got this determinate form, and it imbues the matter. And so he thinks that information theory is vulnerable to that kind of criticism. And in a funny way, this is a sort of criticism that I'm always sort of poking the edges of Whitehead's scheme with, because I'm concerned about determinate. I don't mean determining, but I'm concerned about pre-existent forms, and I'm concerned that the eternal objects can sometimes, in certain treatments of them, appear to rather than just being a kind of biasing of gradients in some field of potential, they can actually seem like discrete forms, which then an individuating system or an actual entity has access to in some sense and can use to inform its traversal of this space of possibility. And there's always this question with all of these systems: what are we positing? What are we taking for granted when we try to explain things in terms of a computational metaphor, or when we posit axioms or forms, anything that's kind of outside of the process of differentiation, of heterogenesis, all these fun words we can talk about. What are we taking as given, and what kind of explanatory debt will that leave us with? So I haven't really answered the question, but I'm just saying that there's lots of resonances with this. So a criticism that we might level at a computational point of view has broad resonances with any issue concerning the pre-existence of discrete, fully formed states, whether they're transcendent or immanent or whatever.
Right. This is a great connection that you're drawing there. Because Simondon's view of how information theory might presuppose some kind of pre-individuated data, that's very similar to Bergson's critique of the virtual, or the potential, I should say, and development of a different conception of possibility. And Deleuze makes a big deal of that. And, in my paper on Whitehead's eternal objects, standing in the flux, I tried to work this out between Bergson and Whitehead. Like, in Whitehead's terms, to what extent are the eternal objects definite prior to ingression, prior to their exemplification in some actual occasion? And Whitehead does at times seem to insist that, well, they must have some definite character even in advance of particular actualizations, because this is where his picture of the primordial nature comes in. They're already being envisaged in their definiteness by the divine. And Whitehead would say, well, that envisagement of their definiteness by God is deficient in actuality. And, we can go down that road, but the connection here to the perspectivalism, which Whitehead also wants to affirm, is that, he has this universe of as you were describing it, multiple perspectives, each course graining its own Umwelt in a sense. But obviously there's relationality there, and there's a sense in which all of these perspectives are in they share a nexus, Whitehead would say. They're not
Mm.
necessarily in society. That depends on there being some determinate characteristic that groups them. But by mentioning coarse graining, there's already a kind of, generalization is playing a role already. The emergence of social order is how Whitehead would describe what coarse graining is all about, because it has both an epistemological side and an ontological side. You can coarse grain in perception because you, as a perceiving being, have been coarse grained by your environment,
Mm.
right? It's a grouping function that's both how you perceive, but also what the conditions of being a perceptual being are, right? And so, but in Whitehead's cosmology, you have these perspectives, they're in nexus with one another. What keeps them from being in conflict and in contradiction with one another is the extensive continuum,
Mm.
which is more general. That conception for Whitehead is the extensive continuum would be like the mathematical eternal objects that give some reliable regular structure to space-time, which is I would say, got to be one of the most important presuppositions of any scientific account of nature, is that space-time is a uniform, necessary
Mm.
structure of some kind. Whitehead would say, though, that actually the extensive continuum would be a set of rules of relation more general than our cosmic epoch and its special spatio-temporal arrangement, that
Mm.
the three dimensions of space and fourth dimension of time that like relativity describes isn't necessarily the only way nature could order itself
Mhm.
in the extensive continuum. But the extensive continuum for Whitehead, which again is a complex eternal object, provides the common nexus of relationships for those multiple perspectives to not be in conflict with each other,
Mhm.
right? And so that's in one of the roles of eternal objects is that it provides a shared reality for all of these perspectives to participate in. And each perspective has a lot of freedom to self-create at the level of its own unique form of coarse graining and relevance realization. But there's also some degree to which it must conform to
Mhm.
the spatio-temporal positions of all of the other perspectives that it is sharing this nexus of relations with. So, why refer to eternal objects? They're not outside of what's actually occurring. They're what allows what's actually occurring from multiple self-differentiating perspectives to remain consistent, to remain logical. Does that
Yeah, that
track? Yeah.
well, I mean, they're a kind of a fundamental, and it can be continuous, but state space.
Yes.
Um, and it's a kind of they're also a constraint, um, and so there's plenty of wiggle room, but it's not infinite latitude. There is a need to come into conformity with, well, there's no option not to, some set of primal or even the transcendentally prior, right? Constraints on state space, even though yes, it's not a three-dimensional space, it's a kind of configuration space or embedded space that we are increasingly familiar with, I think, from physics, but also these days machine
Maybe we
learning.
could call it a topos.
Yeah, okay, and that would emphasize, yeah, so that would emphasize the continuity
Yeah.
rather than being a set of discrete spaces. That actually jives really well with something that I emailed Mike like yesterday, because he and I are talking about this partly because he's definitely uh, And I think that, to your original point, the computational perspective does lead us in this direction. He's working on something, and I forget who he's working it with, but on a kind of Platonic space notion of, something
Yes.
that there's a Platonic space, and there's this idea that, where are the forms coming from? Well, they are in this sort of, it sounds like a transcendent, Platonic realm of forms, and the cells are taking advantage of what is available to them, right? And
Hmm.
I don't necessarily have an issue with that, but I think it's such a nuanced issue. It's such a nuanced thing to sort of delve into. And the question is always, at what point in some kind of process of becoming do these forms themselves, let's say, get individuated, like take on some kind of discrete particular form? And it's almost just, it's the kind of speculation that people who are perhaps too heavily into metaphysics are interested in making. But there are just these different conceptions that go, certainly back to the pre-Socratics and to other philosophical systems in other parts of the world, of what is absolutely prior, what is fundamental, and can it be something that's totally indefinite? So like a pyron, like Anaximander's apeiron. And can you get from that sort of thing to a fairly robust conception of forms that we might rely upon in order to explain these kinds of constraints, and that everything that individuates, everything that evolves comes into conformity with, but can you derive something like that from without just positing it as pre-existent? And I think this is precisely what Simondon is also really trying to think in terms of his notion of the pre-individual. And again, we talked about it last time, but when he's speaking of a supersaturated fluid and he's talking about a crystal forming in that, and I think this is a story that could be told about any kind of dissipative structure, like a crystal is. And this also brings us into these questions of continuity and discreteness, which is something we might hit on as well. Like there might be a level of description of a system, like molecules in sort of Brownian motion, where you could have a discrete description of that, but you could also have a continuous description of that, which is in a sense at that level emergent from the discrete description. But basically where you have an essentially homogeneous solution, which doesn't have discrete high level constraints on it. It's essentially a random mixture, but it has tensions in it and gradients in it. And these gradients might come into being and pass out of being, but it passes through phases where tension builds up. And if it builds up to a certain point, there's an inflection point, a critical point across which a phase transition takes place and a crystal starts forming, or Binard cells form in response to heat coming from above, coming from below. So there's a strong gradient. In that case, external work is being applied to a system. So this is one of Prigoghine's big models, right? But external work is being applied to a system, creating this temperature gradient, and then you get this sudden spontaneous formation of these dissipative structures, which are the Binard cells, and then they become these constraints. And of course, they can actually dissipate and return to the flux, but they become these emergent constraints that are then canalizing the actual motion of the underlying molecules for the duration of their existence. So all of this is to say, how do we get to these can we get to these determinate forms in some fundamental sense from an ultimate picture in which they don't exist, and which they don't we don't have to posit them, basically. And I think yeah, sorry. Just to say that there are a lot, when Simondon is thinking about that kind of thing and using thermodynamic examples, of course, those are predicated on there having been a lot of, prior individuation. He's borrowing a lot from Jung, and Jung is thinking about this in terms of, determinate forms and ideas erupting from the pluripotent potential of the unconscious, right? And we could talk about whether things are there in determinate form, just unconscious, and then they emerge kind of fully formed. But the extensive continuum idea, I think again we can think of that in terms of in terms of these pre-existent maybe tensions, gradients in a landscape of potential, but is that landscape in flux itself? So are those tensions, are those gradients actually themselves transitory until such point as a particular actualization occurs and actually starts to lock in a certain structure to that landscape? Or is it always conforming? And again, if it's topological, it can be both conforming and also metastable, right? It's metastable, but within certain deformations are consistent with it being essentially the same shape. Sorry, there's a lot of things there. So,
well, in terms of thinking about this as a topos, as a topological continuum, Whitehead's always saying possibility is continuous, actuality is atomic. So these perspectives which actualize or individuate, they do have a discreteness about them. They have a sense in which they've made a decision that was one among many possibilities. And once that decision has been made, it's irrevocable. And, one of the other sides to what I was getting at earlier about like living beings don't just perform functions, they produce functions. The new functions that are produced then exist and have an effect in the world, and they didn't even exist before. And now like the world is forever changed by each concrescence, right? By each function which is performed or produced, and then reproduced or reperformed. Like the world is being changed at every step of the way. And so these atomic processes they're cumulative and iterative, right? And this is a point that James Bradley makes that we talked about last time. And is the extensive continuum changed? Is the topology shifted in some sense as a result of what's actualized? Well, can something that is like the realm of eternal objects is infinite in the strong sense of, it can't be depleted. It can't be, there's no new eternal objects. There doesn't need to be. And it's not that they all already exist. It's that they're all already possible. And so can that sort of a realm change? No, right? It doesn't change, except in relationship to what actualizes, it's always new.
Yeah, but also what regions of it are its probability distribution can change. Like if we were thinking about it in terms of a probability distribution associated with the exploration of it by a lineage of actualization, which can be the lineage that is the universe, let's say, then that distribution changes a great deal. So it's what's accessible. So here, again, you brought up Kaufman, but the notion of adjacency, right? It's, okay, maybe we can, in a maximally abstract sense, we can think of, everything that's possible, given no particular contingent history of actualization. And so kind of all actualizations are then possible in a certain sense, right? Yeah. So that maximal configuration space, whether it's continuous or discrete, whatever. But so this, maximal topology or topos if you want, but where we're going to end up on that landscape is the question. And that is changing a great deal based on a contingent history of which potential, which possibilities actually get actualized, become
Yeah.
actualized.
Yeah. So this is the consequent nature of God is changing.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the extensive continuum in relationship to what becomes actualized in the history of the universe, that's that is the definition of change. That is
yeah.
evolution. But
Can I
it's
jump in for just 1 second? Because what I want to say is, I think this is a very tempting vision, um, from a position of a subject like Whitehead or ourselves, who we actually exist at this very derived point in this lineage of actualization, and we're trying to make sense of all the possibilities that and all the counterfactual possibilities, all the possible worlds that haven't been actualized in our past and all that. And so it's necessarily the case, perhaps, that and it's quite intuitive, especially if one's thinking in terms of these sort of mathematical and now computational models of state spaces and the like, to be thinking about this huge state space that pre-existed and this lineage that's exploring it. And I mean, it's a very now a Wolfram type model as well, right?
Mhm.
It's actually a classic evolutionary model. And it's converged upon through from lots of different ways and lots of different yeah. But the question is always, is that something that can be in any sense said to have been pre-existent, or maybe existence is not the word that we want, but maybe it's real. Um,
pre-definite, at least. Yeah.
yeah. Or are we talking about a really constructive process in which it's not only the actual which is being constructed, but the potential is being the possibility landscape of possibility or potential is also being constructed. And so it's very, very difficult to think this through, but it's like to speak of that pre-existent state space is a kind of reification or hypothesization that maybe we don't need, but is a very natural thing for us to do.
Maybe we can distinguish between the possible and the potential here and say that possibilities, something has to be, the universe has to be possible before it can be actual. And so something, possibility would be something more like the realm of eternal objects. The potential, though, would always be relative to what's been actualized. It's
Mm,
what's relevant to what the perspective that has been actualized in its unique spatio-temporal situation. You can't pre-specify or pre-state, the potential or potentiality because of this necessary reference that must be made to some actuality, right? Potential for what? And so in this sense, like it's not Bergson or Simondon's concern about a pre-individuated potential that's just waiting to be actualized. The potential follows what's been actualized. It requires what's been actualized and then becomes salient, relative to that actual occasion, that perspective,
I
right?
think I thought you were almost going to go the other way because I think again, make potential more open or unpre, and possible more determinate in a certain sense, like Kaufman's adjacent possible. Because there's this ancient notion of just something that pure potential or whatever, right? Potential just means it's like dunamis, it's movement, right? It's like
Mhm.
it's metastable, it can change. And I think that there is this image that those thinkers who are trying to think immanence to the hilt and not have any sort of ultimately pre-existent or eternal forms are wanting to start with some image of just pure potential, which is completely unformed. And it wouldn't even make sense to speak of a topology or a state space. It's just the potential for some actualization or something to occur. I think that's the kind of notion that maybe is people have different opinions on what the chasm is in Hesiod, or Anaximander's Apeiron, or I think it's the kind of thing that Simondon's trying to think with the pre-individual. It's
Yeah.
something that it's pluripotent. It
Mhm.
is just potential. There's nothing other than it just has the potential to form something.
I mean, pluripotent unconscious, I think, is a fair Jungian stand-in for primordial nature of God, like because they're both unconscious.
Yeah.
Whitehead's explicit that the primordial nature is unconscious. This isn't a conscious decision to envisage the eternal objects in this way and not that way. It's more an unconscious aesthetic yearning, right?
Yeah.
And so that, that tracks, but it's just the pluripotency implies some that there's some organization. I would some order already implicit in pluripotency,
Well, I
right?
think yearning implies that, because yearning is a drive in a certain, or a lure
Yeah.
in one terms, in a certain direction. But what about just creativity?
Mm,
What,
mm.
prior, like, God is the first creature of creativity. What about just creativity? Boom, as, full stop, as this pure potential, so to speak, the capacity to change, and for concretization, for actualization, etc. But
Well, that's where we have to start,
yeah,
I think, in metaphysics is with creativity. And it's easy, I think, to misread Whitehead as positing a God
sure.
as a principle, but he actually the primordial nature is his attempt to actually to describe fact, to talk about what is most evident at the base of our experience. It's not something he's trying to add as a concept or a founding principle for his deduction. It's more like the premise
Yeah,
is that God is a fact, and the primordial nature is a fact, which is just that there is an aim present.
yeah.
It's not even conscious of what it wants yet, but it's wanting.
It's a gradient, you can say. You
Gradient.
know,
Yeah, yeah.
there's a landscape, and there's, we can descend or we can climb or whatever. But
I'm
there is
almost
a
embarrassed to admit this, but did you see? I watched Jordan Peterson and Dan Dennett because Dennett just died, and I watched their interview, and De- uh, Peterson was trying to get at his idea of God, and it had very much in common with this sense of just like primordial aim or yearning. And he
mm,
was trying to get Dennett to admit that we can't even perceive anything unless there is an aim, an intention, and he wanted to connect it to intentionality that Dennett builds some of his philosophy around, which goes back to Brentano and stuff. And I think it was a conflation of the meaning of intention in that case, and Peterson was stretching to connect it to Dennett. But anyways, it just struck me that his primordial yearning is very much what Peterson is going on about. But he didn't mention Whitehead. But I think it's a similar idea. And I also, just to add, it part of what I found so interesting about polycomputing, as Levin lays it out, is he suggests it as an observer dependent pragmatic
yeah,
approach to the
yeah,
study of designed machines, but also evolved systems, organisms. But there's a double meaning to observer dependence here, because I think if you're going to generalize computation, then so that it applies to living organisms, then I think you're adding the the act of observation itself to the materials that you're studying. You're saying these materials are observing me too. I'm not just observing them,
yeah,
right? So if at least Levin wants to include his own observation of these computational materials as an instance of the phenomenon he's describing, then these are not just computational materials, these are observing materials. And observation, I think, is part of what needs to be added to understand aim here, which is, the part of the aspect of organismic activity that I don't think can be explained purely in terms of a prediction and control calculator, because there's, again, not just a performance of already existing functions,
yeah,
even if they're running simultaneously on the same substrates. That's an insight that's important. but it's also, there's the aim for new functions.
Yeah. Well, Mike would say Mike's quite interested in evolvability as something that gets selected. I
Hmm.
think. And that's a very big subject in evolutionary theory, and it's been a controversial subject. But I think we're more and more comfortable with saying that this is the kind of thing that happens, and there are certainly trade-offs between being, say, highly specialized and being highly adaptable. And some species invest differently. There are different strategies, and so one of the capacities that can evolve and sort of be maximized is this capacity to differentiate oneself, to be adaptable, and that can emerge on different levels. And arguably with say humans, that's emerged on a cognitive level and fueled by language and other things, but maybe fueled by neuroplasticity and all of that. But it can develop on other levels as well, and we can see it in lots of different systems. I could see it in venom systems and sort of exochemical systems, where there is a proliferation of different gene copies and different things, and there's a degree of relaxation on gene expression levels and other things, which contributes to the capacity of this very specific system of an organism to generate novelty. And we see very, very different, even mutation rates, but different amounts of novelty being generated, say even different regions in the genome and things like that. And so this is a kind of an emergent area. And yeah, that's something that Mike is thinking about a lot. But I think he's also very comfortable, would be happy with what you were saying about the observer. Like he's very happy to say that these intelligent materials would be observing him as well. But I think, we talked about this a little bit last time in terms of even, relational properties, or properties being fundamentally relational, and the way things like even rocks and other things are they conform to their environment in a certain way. So they're responsive, right? So if you poke things with external work of any kind, they will potentially change in response to that. And that's kind of where I think things like the free energy principle type perspectives would go with a generalization of observational measurement. And I think that that's very consistent with this relational view that Whitehead would have, but also something like Smolin's causal theory of views. And there's Leibniz certainly lurking in the background of these sorts of views as well, or certainly of the Smolin view. But I think there's a lot of Leibniz in Whitehead with lots of, he's got the relational aspect in terms of there being a feedback mechanism, maybe something that's different, but the idea that each discrete entity, actual entity in Whitehead sense, or dynamic particular, that's Hartshorne, right? Which I like that. That's quite nice. Or a monad in Leibniz's sense, though, has this particular view on, like, perspective. It's a perspectivalism, right? It has a particular perspective on the entire cosmos. So for I guess for Leibniz, it's causally impotent in the sense that everything is in whatever arrangement it is because of this pre-established harmony and all of that. But without getting into that, his perspectives that the monads have are, we would just say that that's actually the constitution of the organism or the entity. So we would just make that it's not a free floating perspective. It's actually the relational nature of the being itself. And it's a graded series of relations, right, in Leibniz's sense, with the entirety of the cosmos. And I think that's very much Whitehead's view, right, that every dynamic particular, every actual entity has a perspective on everything, right? Has its own, like, as you say, envisagement, its own unique envisagement on the whole. And I don't know if we need to go there. I mean, that would, of course, I think that's probably one of the reasons why some people were attracted to bringing Bohmian views of quantum mechanics into dialogue with Whitehead's views.
Mhm.
And I guess there are lots of interesting things in physics that could be brought into dialogue there. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciate all of that, and I wonder if the attempt through the application of the free energy principle to, create a gradient of agency down such that rocks can be understood as, minimal cognitive systems is fine, but there's a way, and I found the quote in Whitehead's Function of Reason, where I think there's some justification for framing the question in a slightly different way, where, he's talking about the evolution of more complex organisms and the apparent, directionality towards complexity in and towards organisms which are more complex but comparatively deficient in survival value. And he says, mankind has gradually developed from the lowliest forms of life and must therefore be explained in terms applicable to all such forms. Great. But why construe the later forms by analogy to the earlier forms? Why not reverse the process? So, and then he goes on to talk about how there's clear evidence that certain operations of certain animal bodies depend on the foresight of an end and the purpose to attain it. It is no solution of the problem to ignore this evidence because other operations have been explained in terms of physical and chemical laws. A scientist has patiently designed experiments for the purpose of sustaining and substantiating his belief that animal operations are motivated by no purposes. He has perhaps spent his spare time in writing articles to prove that human beings are as other animals, so that purpose is a category irrelevant for the explanation of their bodily activities, his own activities included. And then the famous line, scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study. So why not reverse the process? So
yeah.
these conscious scientists have evolved. And if we're imagining that computation, generally speaking, again, is just a matter of making predictions with limited information about one's environment. So it's an attempt to predict and control. Can that and there's a way of construing science as nothing but that sort of an instrumental anti-realist
Mhm.
modeling activity,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
If you and I both agree that we want a more participatory and realist understanding of what scientific knowledge is about, I think we need, in Whitehead sense, reverse the process. Start from that sense that the human being, the conscious scientist, can know the world really and construe experience in the terms that would make that possible
Yeah.
and push that all the way down, or if not experience, then intelligent agency. What are we generalizing that looks different when we're affirming a realist onto-epistemology that might be lost in a purely Bayesian understanding of what scientific cognition itself is, and then generalizing that down to rocks?
Yeah. Well,
Does
there are a
that
bunch of
question make sense?
well, it totally makes sense. I mean, I think we've touched on it a bunch of times, in the sense that well, there are just a number of things that you've got there. So you've got, purposes and aims,
Mhm.
and how those might either be fundamental or be emergent to some degree. You've got, I mean, how do we justify a realist interpretation of something like a Bayesian perspective on science and cognition, indeed. And then you've also got the evolution of complexity. So, Whitehead was talking about that as well, and I can't remember if that quote is nearby to the bit where he talks about, complexity can't be explained in terms of its survival value, essentially, because, the art of persistence is to be, well, the art of persistence is to be dead. And, I'm obviously mixing up slightly different things that he's saying there, but he's basically saying that we can't explain the evolution of, more and more complex forms simply in terms of their capacity to persist, because that doesn't necessarily, those things don't necessarily correlate. So there are quite a number of things to attempt to address there. And so one thing in terms of, aims and purposes, I think we can definitely tell a story where they derive from the the existence of irreversible processes in nature. So even what you're talking about in terms of the primordial yearning or lure or drive, but the existence of a fundamental gradient, let's say, which seems to be a necessary posit for speaking about any kind of individuation or actualization. There's already a directionality in that kind of process, and so we would certainly be wanting to problematize the assumptions of absolute time symmetry or whatever. We want to say, and I think there is just so many examples from physics itself that we can draw upon. Obviously thermodynamics, but also quantum mechanics. That there are irreversible processes going on here, and those can be the seeds of something that would later be purpose. I mean, as you know, I'm a big believer in sort of natural purposes, to put it that way. That this again comes to this question of the purposes don't need to be pre-installed like they would be in an actual computer perhaps, or in a information theoretic conception. As we're talking about, the purposes can be achieved, can evolve. But they are derived from the existence of irreversible processes and sort of fundamental. We always have this problem of what are the terms we're going to choose to generalize. Like, are we going to generalize a term like purpose or aim or whatever? And I think we can reason analogically, in the sense that we discussed last time with Simondon's allegmatics. So we're reasoning in terms of an analogy in functional operation, or in a logic of actualization and its inherent directionality. And we can say that purposes, we can reason from purposes that we actually experience to this more general process of actualization that turns out we find it everywhere, or we find it all over the scientific landscape, things that look like that can be reasonably interpreted in terms of that. But we then wouldn't have to say that those things are purposeful, right? We can definitely tell a story about the local emergence of purposes in, say, organisms, and that could be one of the differentiating or distinguishing features of living systems. But nonetheless, there's a lot of overlap between non-living, just physics systems and their directionality or irreversibility. So I think that there's a story that one can tell there. And I think that would already take us part of the way towards an affirmation of some kind of realism. And it does link even to debates over the legacy of Darwin, and whether Darwin removes the need for purposes from our ontology, or whether he naturalizes purpose. I think it's fairly clear that Darwin himself felt like he was naturalizing purposes, but he's often been interpreted, probably more in the 20th century, as in an eliminative, reductionist sort of context, where he's eliminating purposes and they are shown to be not real in some sense. And a lot of what we're talking about maybe links into this, tendency in perhaps in certain scientific circles towards eliminative reductionism. Like, if we can explain, or explain is already a fraught word, but if we could build up a notion of purpose from lower level phenomena or non-purposeful phenomena, that in a sense we would have got rid of purpose, we would have reduced, we would have eliminated the need for an account of purpose, because really all it is just these irreversible physical processes. And I don't think that follows. But so if we're trying to generalize this, FEP type view, and I think what we're doing is we are, and I do think we've been talking about this quite a lot in our conversations, is we're painting a picture from basic physical systems to properly cognitive systems, and agential systems. and we are, and I mean, thankfully, that's the kind of work that the FEP crowd is already doing. But I think we're trying to show how, in the very terms of that research program itself, this kind of process is so embedded in the structure and the logic of reality, that there's absolutely no reason to then take the human epistemic access or perspective on the world and break it out of that and say that well, it's just floating pure hallucination, or it's because it's a hypothesis or a model, it's therefore detached from and not connected to that reality. So we are bringing an account which kind of looks like causal efficacy in Whiteheadian terms, where entities are coming into conformity with their environment because things in their environment are like pushing on them in different ways and canalizing them in certain discrete forms. And then we're building that up through a kind of perspectivalist or polycomputational story through Whitehead's account of symbolism to a kind of realist conception of that. And I think by grounding it in these really basic physical processes, I think that's part of our account of its ultimate, or why it's completely reasonable, at least, because we're not necessarily trying to make ultimate claims that we'll be good fallibilists, but why it's completely reasonable to think of this as real and fully consistent with a scientific image of the world. And I think that the really difficult thing to do is, because, and I think again Whitehead speaks to this kind of thing, but because our phenomenology is so continuously in flux, right? Things are changing all the time, and thoughts are coming up, and a lot of these sort of models of individuation and things, and even creation myths, and this long history of talking about how things come into being. And of course, Jung is a really good touchstone for bringing a lot of these things together, but also for rigorously bracketing, rigorously. I mean, not really rigorous in Jung's sense, but always saying that I'm not talking about metaphysics, I'm talking about psychic reality. Don't get me twisted, But because our phenomenology is in flux, and we see things coming into being and going away from being all the time, but when we look out at the world, things seem to be very static in relation to that. There are lots of very persistent objects. It's hard to imagine that the environment, just on a different time scale, is also this roiling, changing landscape that can really only be described, and this actually links to Kaufman's unprestatability, because it's changing, and because there is this kind of pluripotency, or there's this potential that's that's continually present, never exhausted. It can really only be described in probabilistic terms. Like we could never have a deterministic model of where things are actually going. And of course, some people will say, oh, there are just so many moving parts. In principle, we could have this deterministic model, but because of deterministic chaos, etc., we just can't actually do that in practice. And I just don't think that there's a salient, a particularly strong reason to do that, other than some kind of longing for absolute predictability, or and a historical legacy of deterministic views, which are ultimately theological views, that makes them attractive in a certain way. That's something we could also talk about. There's perhaps a bias that I think there are competing biases that we have. That we have a freedom, a longing for freedom and autonomy, and that can bias our reasoning in favor of agential accounts and affirmation of free will and things like that. We also have a longing to be absolved of responsibility. We have a longing to believe that things are playing out in some sort of predetermined way. And these are very competing biases, probably in all of us. But people have, it does seem like individuals have more of a propensity to glom onto one of those things rather than the other. And that partly can underlie some, just intuitions that people have about metaphysics, or preference people have for different metaphysical pictures. And I think we, as people who prefer the agential accounts, of course, have to be alive to that and constantly criticizing our own views in light of those proclivities that we might have. But what I'm trying to say is that if we can really think the environment as this dynamic thing that's that's constantly in flux, it then will make sense that this doesn't undermine its reality. It does make sense that the only kind of access we could have to it is in terms of a kind of probabilistic and predictive model. And that might be also a way, and I guess I'm probably waffling here, and I don't know if I'm connecting all of these things, but that's probably a way we can also talk about not only are we ourselves capable of formulating apparently novel ideas, we're traversing this space of possibility at some higher cognitive level, and it's not apparently for us, it's not just the play of a pre-given structure, but it is the possibility, it's the operational possibility of the derivation of novel structures. And that again underlies Simondon's distinction between operation and structure, but also Raymond Rouillé would talk about the difference between improvisation in the creation of novel forms, novel structures, and he would say function would be the pre-play, would be the play of pre-given structures. Anyway, there are lots of ways of getting at that, and I do, going right back to the beginning of this discussion, I do think that's one of the fundamental issues here. It's how do novel things come into existence, and that might be something we can drill down on next after you respond to this exceedingly and increasingly long monologue.
Well,
So,
there's a lot there I want to touch on. I mean, the connection between this desire for determinism or freedom and theology and one's theology, I think is quite interesting, even and especially in the case of Bayes himself, who was a Presbyterian minister and Calvinist, right? So I mean, I'm not sure I assume that means he's into predestination. And so, God determines in advance who's going to heaven and hell. It doesn't matter what you do, or merit or anything like that. And so I wonder then, this brings me back to my concern about a Bayesian understanding of intelligence at whatever scale, but in the human case, if that's what consciousness and cognition is primarily about, is the basic picture that there's a kind of finite calculator in the head. The brain is the calculator. It's not as good as God. God's got infinite calculative capacity, and so predestines everything. But we've just got this little dinky calculator, and it's also in this black box that's cut off from the world except through sensory channels. So we get some sense data, and we're constantly recalculating our predictions based on how that data comes in and how the world responds to the actions that we decide to take. So that's I think the old model of what computation is, or what kind of agency that computation could grant a machine or organism, if we generalize this. But I think you're right that there is a theology behind this picture, which is like that God is being imagined as the giant calculator, the infinite calculator, who knows the position and momentum of every particle. But we just, poor human beings, we just have a little calculator, and we can't know the position of every particle. And so we guess. Right. And I wonder if that picture, which, maybe FEP has found ways of incorporating the enactivist point of view here. But, when we go back to Thompson et al.'s criticisms of FEP, there's the lack of like the history of structural coupling, where like every organism has co-evolved with an environment, and that coevolution and that structural coupling means that it doesn't need to just guess how it's going to relate to the world out there. So much of that is just a function of being in resonance. That like adaptation is a resonance function, and I as I say that, I can see how FEP could totally account for that too, no problem. But it's just the like, I do, you mentioned causal efficacy, and maybe we can still find ways of describing FEP such that it is more than just a account of cognition in terms of some sort of representation based on sense data of a world that's forever beyond our capacity to mentally represent, like that our representations are just controlled hallucinations. If FEP can be rendered so as to include this sense of bodily resonance with an environment that has never been separate from the organismic agency that is being expressed, then I'm happy for it to be, to include it in our meta generalizations here. But I'm not sure. I don't yet have a clear enough sense as to whether this Bayesian approach presupposes a conception of knowledge and of the ultimate nature of reality that is not the kind of theology that I would want to put forward.
Yeah, nice. I maybe it doesn't matter. Well, I would say that in certain hands, in certain minds, that the FEP approach very well could presuppose those things, and there are, more or less representationalist accounts, and yeah, but when it's really truly generalized, and we imagine that everything every entity is engaged in this kind of process, could be thought of as if they are engaged in this kind of process. So they are coming into a kind of, again, to me, it is a theory. It is potentially, at least, a theory of resonance, and I do think there are close relationships between dissonance and dissonance and resonance. Indeed, dissipation and resonance, actually. And I don't know if I'm prepared to articulate that right now, but I think that that's actually something that's worth digging into, like the physics of dissipation and resonance and how they are similar and different.
Yeah.
But I do feel like when this picture is properly generalized, then it necessarily has to come apart from this kind of, instrumentalist, anti-realist. It's really trying to show what the logic of the research program itself would be indicating were we to take it sufficiently seriously. And yeah, and so I think it's very consistent with this much more, dynamic realism. I think part of the problem is probably that there's a history of a certain kind, just say substance metaphysics or whatever, but there's a particular view of things where, again, it might seem like the mind is dynamic, but everything else seems like it couldn't be dynamic in the same way that the mind is. But if you can really generalize that thought, and then you can bring the FEP into a proper, process ontology picture, it's going to look very different from that, again, so-called representationalist account.
Has anyone talked about, or have you thought about the way in which, in the FEP point of view, with like Markov blankets and everything, sort of isolating an interior and an exterior, when that picture in relationship to what Mike Levin is doing, framing this in terms of collective intelligence of cellular communities, like each cell, it has its own blanket, and yet the functions are realized, I mean, at multiple levels, but the function of the multicellular animal is in between the cells, not within any of them as Markov blankets. And so they're nested blankets, I guess, is how that would be explained.
But it's also, like I said right at the end, I think, of our last chat, the organism as a whole, if we're talking about a multicellular organism, is it's this pregnant multiplicity of, say, attractors, and it's the tension of all of these different, perspectives, if you want, where perspective is thought of in terms of these attractor states, the thing as a whole is kind of being held up by the tension between its parts in a certain sense. Um, and that's so everything is mutually constraining, and therefore also enabling. So that enablement view of constraints. Cells are constraining the possibilities of their neighbors, and that is the thing that is scaling and is also graded, right? So within a particular tissue type, there's a certain kind of constraint function, but between tissue types, there's a certain kind of constraint function, and then at the level of the whole, there is this. And again, the whole, this is somewhat arbitrary where we're going to be drawing these boundaries, because then we can start thinking about the whole as being, environment and organism coupling and all of that. But the whole thing is sort of held together by these tensions. And when you abstract a subset of that system, and Mike's example of anthrobots and xenobots is a nice one for this. But I've got lots of molecular examples. But when you take something that's being constrained by its particular role in the collective out, suddenly a lot of this potential, which has already always been there but held in a certain kind of tension, right, or constrained, canalized, is suddenly unleashed in a certain sense, or unlocked, and a new space of possibility is straight away being explored. So yeah, I think that's part of the way we can again think about the way novelty can be generated as well, is when something is taken out of its particular set of constraint functions, which are all these attractor states, and put into a novel environment. Its energetic landscape changes, but its potential fitness landscape changes, et cetera, and it's suddenly, it's like a drift in a certain way, and it has to, it's like adapt or survive at that point. It's like if you take a whole organism out of the ecosystem which it is adapted to, and then it's in all of these constraint tensions, relationships of constraint with all the other organisms in its environment, and you put it in a new environment, and suddenly that landscape of constraint changes. It either finds a new way to be, or it, doesn't survive that change.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm still just thinking about the theological implications of all of this, and the thinking through those aspects of Whitehead's cosmology, namely the theological aspects that are especially difficult for scientists to
Yeah.
find relevant, or when they hear about the theology of it, decide that Whitehead's not actually something they want to get into or apply to their thought. But like the sorts of powers that we believe that organisms have depends in large part on whether or not we conceive of the universe as a whole as itself organized, I guess, or in old more classical theological terms, whether or not the universe is designed for a purpose.
Yeah.
And there are ways of thinking about design and purpose and teleology that are theological in the sense that they're externally imposed. And I'm with you on the need for natural purposes, which
Well,
are
also
imminent. Mhm.
sorry, yeah. I mean, it's just also the key difference between a computer,
Right,
as
exactly.
an artifact or as a machine, and a computational account of an organism which is self-organizing, which has a degree of autonomy to again discover its own goals. And so the question is, within a Whiteheadian ontology, I think we're trying to think the universe as self-organizing, right? And so that again draws into it problematizes this idea of there being a pre-existent landscape in a certain sense.
Right, but I guess part of what I'm getting at with the theological side of all of this is that, when Whitehead says, why not reverse the explanatory process? He's saying, okay, so we know that this human being thing exists that wants to come up with a scientific explanation of the universe, and that historically, science has emerged in this very theistic culture.
Mm.
And he's very adamant in Science in the Modern World that that's not an accident. And so, somehow, so for Whitehead to explain the human being and also the conditions that make scientific knowledge possible, like that there is a rational creature in this universe, at least one, and so reversing the process of explanation for him means like, okay, so what would the macrocosmic example of what we in the mesocosmic scale experience as our own intelligence, what would the macrocosmic example of that be? And can that then form, one of the touch points for our metaphysics or our cosmology, just as much as the microcosmic might form it? Like, we want to understand what's the smallest energetic event that we can measure and predict. Okay, microcosmic exemplification of this process of what relevance realization, to use Vervaeke's term, or just agency,
Yeah.
right? And so we blow it up to the macro. We can distill it down to the micro, but to go to the theological scale can be helpful. It's like, it's the same reason that in the Republic, Plato says, if we want to understand the human soul, let's blow it up to the size of a city state and then analyze that.
Yeah.
And so when we think about what agency is, for Whitehead, one of the ways of imagining our way or speculating our way through that problem is to imagine how, like, what would be a naturalistic way of explaining a divine, a moment in the life of God, or a divine cognition, or you know, a decision at the macrocosmic scale,
Yeah.
right? And that's why Whitehead has this distinction between eternal objects and actual occasions, to sort of understand what the ingredients might be to make sense of a divine decision at that macrocosmic scale that would afford agency and purpose of a sort that's not this old design paradigm where you have a plan in advance
Yeah.
that is then imposed upon a slave world, or a purely passive, material chaos that just gets imprinted with the plan.
Isomorphism.
Holomorphism. How do you understand purpose in a way that is more creative, in the
Yeah. And,
sense of not creative? Well, creative doesn't necessarily get at it. That's more participatory, let's say.
well, imminent,
Imminent.
right?
Yeah.
Imminent, not transcendently imposed.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
more relational, let's say, where there's more of a call and response between God and the world. And that, as Whitehead would say, the God is created by the world just as much as the world is created by God, if you're going to think in terms of
And
creation.
I think that that's Whitehead's attempt. I mean, you can correct me if you feel this is a bad reading, but to yeah, I mean, to pacify the potential discord between he wants to create a theology which is consistent with the science of his time and the logic and mathematics that he was, a leading expert in. And he wants to show how these images of the world can sort of peacefully coexist. And so it's an attempt to immanentize God in that sense as well, right? Um,
Imminent, I think relationalize, if you want, might be better, just because, yes, he wants to secularize the function of the gods, of the concept of God. He's clearly, explicitly says that, secularize, which could be synonymous with immanentize. But there is still something, there's still room for transcendence in Whitehead's
yeah,
metaphysics, his cosmology, in the sense, but he'll say the world transcends God just as much as God transcends the world.
yeah,
Just meaning that you know,
It's a relative transcendence, though.
yeah, a
Um,
relational transcendence. Yeah,
yeah,
sure. Hmm.
yeah. But, so not a kind of pure transcendence
No.
in the way it would have maybe been classically conceived. I mean, so the microcosm macrocosm stuff is I just take that as, you know, the core of the organicist view in a certain sense, right? And yes, going back to Plato and going back to, you know, Hermes Trismegistus and all that, you know, as above so below, like it's an ancient view, right? And I think that that's also exactly what, say, Simondon is trying to get at with these operational analogies. And so we're thinking about scale-free processes of individuation
Right.
or
Right.
actualization.
How does a universe individuate itself?
Yeah,
That's why
and
we do theology, is to answer that question.
yeah, okay, yeah, totally fair. But it's in a sense also why we do cosmology. And you know, when you talk about the micro and the macro, and there's this mutually implicative relationship between the two, and there is a sense in which, in a big evolutionary picture. But you know that could be either connected to something like the Anaximander image that we were talking about, of kind of beginning in a sort of state of like pure creativity or pure potential or something, the indefinite, the pre-individual, the unprethinged, you know, that kind of classic view.
Mhm.
But also you could connect it to something like you know, a Big Bang singularity type view. But there's a sense in which the at some point the micro and the macro are the same thing,
Mhm.
uh, and then they are in a sense differentiated. There's a persistence of the micro dynamic, but it's now enveloped within a macro system, which is starting to provide the canalizing constraints on future micro events, so on future processes of actualization. And I think that, you know, Spinoza is going to be an important touch point in terms of, and again, not taking the Spinozan view whole hog, and again, there are lots of different views on that anyway, but the kind of theology or the kind of God that we get from a picture of a self-organizing universe is, it's a little bit like, again, macrocosm, microcosm, it's a little bit like the relationship between a whole multicellular organism and its constituent parts in a certain sense. So
Mhm.
the cells have aims, and if they were free swimming cells, you know, unicellular organisms, they would have particular goals appropriate to that sort of scale of existence, time scale, spatial scale, etc. That cognitive light cone, as Levin would say. Um, and then, of course, as they are aggregated into these multicellular collectives, and then, of course, shaped and differentiated by the enabling constraints of becoming part of such a collective, there are also emergent goals at the level of the whole organism. And in a certain sense, yes, it's like the individual is to the city, as the cell is to the individual, or the city or the planet is to the galaxy, is to the, you know, like these are all these nested, um, but mutually like co-constituting relational scales, right? So we don't have a pure transcendence in the sense that there isn't this external organizer or you know, ordering principle. It is immanent. That's what I mean by immanence in that sense. Like it's
Sure.
all,
Yeah.
you know, self organizing, self actualizing, but all these different scales. And it just can be the case that yes, we as entities that exist at a certain scale, we have this direct experience of our agency and our purposes and things like that. And we want to think of what is the analogy that exists at other scales. But it's an analogy in terms of an operational analogy. So again, self-organization, processes of actualization, that kind of logic. But it doesn't mean that all of the qualities or all of the properties even associated with these processes of actualization as they are, you know, embodied and actualized at a particular scale, exist at all scales, right? And that's why we have this question about how we generalize a a logic of actualization or self-organization or whatever, but are we generalizing terms along with it? So we're saying that purpose or aim, formation of novel aims as Holism is a particular manifestation of this logic of actualization, and that is also operative at the level of.
You're breaking up a lot now, Tim. Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, got you. Not sure what happened there. My Zoom crashed. Too much.
Yeah, like the last 10 seconds of what you were saying started to get garbled. You're talking about the process of actualization and generalizing the logic of that process.
Yeah, I mean the same thing we've been talking about a lot to some degree, but
Yeah.
just saying that there can be an analogy of purpose or directionality that would be existent at the level of the whole, but it doesn't necessarily have all the same qualities as purpose at the level of there could be something very special about existing at a particular scale, and that actually could be to do with. And really, Carl Friston would certainly talk about this kind of thing, but existing at a certain scale between the micro scale, where there's a lot of essentially, stochastic activity and things are also moving very, very fast, and a certain macro scale where things are solenoidal. And being at a certain, and I mean, this is again an ancient image. It's like being on the cusp of chaos and order, right? But there's a certain Goldilocks zone where you get complex agents, and I'm not, I don't want to lean on that as something that's convenient for saying, for sweeping these other questions under the rug. I just think I take that to be a reasonable perspective to take, that there is something very special about being in a particular zone, and that there is a physical, well, a physical, an account we could give in terms of physical science, but also I think quite a reasonable philosophical account we can give about, again, that's what makes living systems and agential systems potentially quite special. It's partly a factor of being in the right scale, essentially.
Mm.
So there
Yeah.
are these scale-free, we've got microcosm, macrocosm relationships, and there are these scale-free logics, but nonetheless something special about being at a particular scale.
Yeah. I mean, that it might be a continuum between designed and evolved
Hmm.
systems, but I do worry that design systems just can't, like we're not, human beings are not smart enough to make machines that are in as deep resonance with their environments as the organisms which have evolved in those environments with those environments. So I should say that have co-evolved with those environments.
Nice.
Because it's like, yes, it we could be talking about different kinds of computation here, but anything we design and anything that we design to machine learn itself into some kind of intelligent behavior it's just impossible to expect that it could become as adapted to the environment as an organism, right? Because the organism's literally been co-evolving with that environment for billions of years.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, for the whole history of the universe, right? In the sense that
Yeah.
organisms had to be constituted by this process at some point and then continue evolving as organisms.
I like the term environmentality for
Mm.
that, which I didn't coin that, but just understanding evolution is always co-evolution of organisms and environments.
Yeah,
And that does put limits on what we can expect. And it also raises questions about the risks
yeah,
of, designing learning systems or designing agents that we in even if yeah, that we just can't predict well enough to know how they're going to affect the environment, and what they might do, because and this is a risk in the biological world too. I mean, pandemics happen, like things can go haywire even when you're talking about an ecology that's 4 billion years old, like or a biosphere that's 4 billion years old. Like things go wrong all the time.
Well, I mean, wrong being a very much a
Yeah.
perspectival judgment, and
Yeah.
the unstateability of emergent novel forms is part of what's going wrong from the perspective of an agent who's very invested in predicting its environment.
But this is part of like the new it's not just a new conception of computation, but of intelligence. Like
Mm,
we're so used to thinking of intelligence in a very individualized sense,
yeah,
whereas what I think Mike's work is pointing to is how collective intelligence is, that all
yeah,
in the living world, all function is and purpose is coactively realized, which is to say there's a whole swarm of agents which you could isolate and say they each have their own interests, but they're, I mean, maybe one of the implications of polycomputing is that, agency is always co-agency. It's always discovered with those that you're adjacent to, that you
yeah.
come through these adaptive evolutionary processes of you enter into symbiosis with those fellow agents and realize purposes beyond what independent any individual can even fathom. And
Yeah.
so
And
it's
it can start
intelligence
out.
is a very messy process.
Definitely, and it's very messy in the sense that it can, a lot of those relationships, those symbiotic relationships, can start out with a particular kind of valence, like they can be antagonistic, and then they flip at a certain point into a mutualism. And I mean, that's not just a hand wavy thing. Again, we could work through some molecular examples of that kind of thing, and that's part of what I am writing about with Mike at the moment. I mean, it's that happens all the time. Um, so so yes, it's very messy in that sense. I mean, I feel like we kind of and probably because my Zoom crashed, there was a bit of a shift in what we were talking about all of a sudden to you know the emergence of agents in machine learning and that sort of stuff, and what would make them different from biological agents. And I take that to be a slightly different
Hmm.
subject, a related, definitely subject. And I have been asked to work on a paper on again analogies between machine learning and biological evolution. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. And I do think that there'll be an interesting Whiteheadian treatment as well,
Mhm.
probably building up from the linear algebra and stuff. And there'll even be like there'll be mathematical conjunctions between the kind of maths that Whitehead was working through and the kind of stuff that we see come to a certain kind of fruition in these machine learning algorithms. But that's a big discussion in and of itself, and I'm not prepared to have it yet. But I see possibilities there.
Hmm.
But I absolutely agree with you that these systems that are largely sequestered away from the world, except being exposed to the kind of data that we make available to them and all of that, they're capacities for learning and resonance are obviously going to be curtailed by the degree of relationality that they are able to achieve from within their boxes.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I think one of the key things is probably a need to rethink causation to some degree. I think this is coming up a lot here. Um, in a relational so we talk about causal efficacy in Whitehead's sense, and that can sound like efficient cause, and we have this obviously that's an Aristotelian notion, but we have a kind of Newtonian image of things like banging into each other, and maybe that's not entirely a bad image, but you just have to think about that as a relational thing again, right? Because if things are banging into each other in some idealized abstract sense, they are constraining each other or canalizing each other. And there'll be a way in which a processual account of cause makes cause and constraint, converge with each other.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about these sort of
Yeah.
primordial conditions, where some eternal dynamic creative process is constrained by things. You know, at that point, cause and constraint are just going to be the same thing in a certain sense. But that also will help us to break out of any kind of maximally deterministic view of
Yeah.
causation. Um, we can think about sort of, you know, degrees of constraint, and you can always think about wiggle room and all of that in that kind of sense, you know. So things it does feel to me like, as we talk about this and as I've been thinking about this kind of project a lot, it touches on almost everything, you know, and you have to get very, very fundamental, and ultimately, this is the kind of thing that if it becomes, you know, generative through some of the earlier things that we write on, it'll be a long term, you know, program for bringing these kinds of computational views in line with a sort of Whiteheadian view. And I think, you know, where you threw me a little bit by jumping into the machine learning discussion is that I do definitely see computation as something more abstract and more, you know, almost metaphorical, perhaps. But we're not thinking about necessarily literal computers here. We're thinking about, again, these logics, which are physically instantiated, and remembering that, you know, computation is very much a physical process, so it's part of this, you know, ordered relational cosmos that you and I are trying to describe. So it's at the very least embedded within that, possible within that, but not free floating is basically what I'm trying to say. But there's a certain kind of logic of, you know, it's basically just states being updated according to constraining rules. You know, it's the generalization of the function. Exactly. It's, you know, you know, and you can think in terms of cellular automata, and you know, Wolfram obviously takes these things a long way. But you know, when you've got an arrangement that looks like this, you know, change it to this. You know, there's a rule which dictates that, and that is just a constraint function. And it may be that in a classical computer, that is a deterministic function, like all A's always become, you know, all A's always become B's in the same deterministic manner or whatever. Whereas when we're generalizing this kind of thing, we are thinking about a non-deterministic Turing machine, which is a thing, but we're thinking about a stochastic process that is involved, and that brings us straight away into the realms of probability and all of that, which is how these things come together. You know, there is a it's not none of these are deterministic models that we're really talking about. There might be constraints, but there's also this constant perturbation, which means that with some degree, and again, when we have a probabilistic distribution, we don't have like total confidence in that or whatever. That's just our current estimation of the way things are. But there is a certain chance of deviation from that. And if the deviation is sufficiently far enough, now thinking in terms of dynamical systems, we might be shifting from one orbit to another. So instead of snapping back in the next step to the previous rule, we're actually now, and I'm mixing all these different ways of framing things, but we're actually now in the orbit of another attractor, but another rule is going to govern ongoing evolution from that point. And I don't necessarily like govern. Again, I would just say canalize or constrain and enable. And the really difficult thing to think about, though, which again brings us right back to the beginning, is how those new constraint functions are actually generated in this process. And actually, I don't think this is a particularly difficult. I think I can think this through pretty lucidly within biology and through some of the molecular examples that we've talked a little bit about before. We talked a bit about with Merlin and maybe in some of our previous discussions. But I think there's a way of rendering these things relatively lucidly there, and then that kind of thing needs to be ported back into the FEP discussion, etc., whatever. But it is as you brought up at the beginning. It's a common concern people have with computational or information theoretic type accounts, where there seems to be a premature generalization of those sorts of accounts to say basically, oh, life is just an information processing system or is a computational system or whatever. It's like, yeah, but how does actual novelty get generated here? Is there a non-computational or a whatever process that goes on there? And just to finish this spiel, it's something like we talked last week about the relational realism view of quantum mechanics and this kind of progressive transition from this landscape of potential, a sort of pluripotent field, which does have a topology, so it does have, gradients, but then winnowing to a probabilistic landscape, which is, that much closer to coming into a determinate actualization. So it's a graded thing. And there's the possibility of novelty emerging in that winnowing.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier with causation and causal efficacy, because it struck me that in a sort of default materialistic imagination, we immediately go to, when we think of causation, like one particle colliding with another particle, and we think of causation in terms of motion, the motion of bodies and the exchange of forces between bodies. And I think causation, as Whitehead is trying to reimagine it, is more so it's actually closer to memory than it is to motion or the exchange of forces between bodies, or even emotion. Like these are rather than just thinking of it as the exchange of a force from one moving body to another, causation, which isn't, that's one way of thinking of efficient causality, but it's the predominant one in a materialistic or mechanistic ontology. But Whitehead is saying that causation and causal efficacy it's about the propagation of the past and into the present. And I've heard Mike ask questions, and he gets asked this question all the time, like, well, where's this pattern stored in this bioelectric field that emerges in the course of the developmental history of an organism? Where's the pattern stored? And he's not sure. But this idea of a Platonic morphospace comes up, and he's exploring that as a hypothesis, which is cool. But I think when we understand Whitehead's view of causality, it's like that becomes the wrong question to ask. Where is it stored? It's there in the past, because like the present is the past is constantly accumulating in the present, and it's still present here with us. It's not somewhere else, right? But the idea of memories having to be stored, it's not that I'm saying they're stored in the past, because the past isn't somewhere else besides what's already here. It's more, I mean, and Bergson is so good on this question too, on the nature of memory being, it's like it's implicit in the and non-locally extended throughout the whole of the universe, moment by moment. And it's shifting our ontology, which this can be done in a computational way, just a non-deterministic form of computation, where the iterations are always being added to, or accumulated, I should say, such that the computation is open-ended in a sense, and there's not a closed algorithmic loop, but the constant accumulation of novelty that then does get stored in some sense, but it's stored in the field of potentiality that remains relevant to what occurs in the present. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm starting to hand wave here a little bit, but I think the idea is that this reimagination of causality in Whiteheadian terms can be generative for thinking about what would remain mysterious in the old materialistic, mechanistic paradigm, things like memory, things like emotion, things like aim. I think when we start to view causality as this inheritance of the aims of the past.
Yeah, no, I think memory, habit, etc. These are really, really key notions, and I think that that's exactly what I'm trying to get at when I'm talking about this even actualization event as setting, a set of primary constraints. So, what has previously actualized, and because all these things are happening on different temporal scales, some things are much more stable than others. And those stable things are the landscape that the ephemeral things come into and that are canalized by. And some of the most stable things are these, deep physical symmetries and deep, there are relational constraints that we can describe in terms of, they get described in terms of physical laws or like the constitution of the standard model or whatever. But those are all relational constraints, which are the habits of the cosmic epoch or whatever. And maybe they didn't, and we don't want to get into fine tuning and all of that necessarily. We can do, but maybe they didn't have to be the way that they are. I mean, they had to be the way they are for us to be here, and that's kind of a trivial observation in a certain sense, right? We wouldn't be if the universe wasn't the way that it is. But maybe, again, if we're starting from a model of a kind of, pluripotent creativity as the fundamental thing, but which also persists, but as the fundamental thing, then it could have taken many different kinds of arrangements, but it happened to, I mean, I know people don't like this kind of talk of like frozen accidents and whatever, but it's, it took a certain arrangement, and this becomes this relational arrangement. It's stabilized by the formation of certain kinds of relationships. And that becomes the constraint function which canalizes everything else. And so that, in a sense, is the birth of some of these more determinate forms or eternal objects. That's the primordial instrument at some point there. You get this landscape all of a sudden, which forms because, and so that means peaks, troughs, etc., canals, ways things are going to be constrained, things that things are going to have to come into conformity with. Isn't that like determinism doesn't enter the picture at all in the sense that there could be, practically or functionally infinite number of ways of being in conformity with a set of fundamental constraints. Just like, people will say about the free energy principle that it's like if a system is persisting over time, as that system, if it's identifiable as the same system through a sequence of events, it will necessarily, so the claim goes, be obeying this certain, be modelable in terms of this formalism or obeying this certain set of constraints. It's basically what it is to be a thing over time. That's what the free energy principle attempts to provide for us. But there are any number of ways of being that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and once you've accepted a evolutionary cosmology, it seems to me that the mystery of fine tuning kind of goes away because, I mean, it's still mysterious, but it becomes something more like fine tuning of fundamental constants becomes something more like the emergent attunement of co-creative constraints. Like it appears finely tuned, these fundamental constants from our point of view, because we're still projecting stasis onto something that's an evolutionary process. It doesn't just happen to be that way. It's that way because there was a co-evolution of everything in the universe, all of the fields and the particles, or the relative standing waves that emerge out of these fields over the course of history are co-evolved, just like organisms and environments evolve with each other. It should be no surprise that there would be this attunement, right?
Yeah, and we are attuned to it. Obviously, we were made. It's a constraint on us, but we're made possible by that constraint on possibility. And of course, so it's beautiful to us as well. We are made of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's romantic.
Yeah.
And that's
Uh,
okay. I mean, I think, I don't know, there's the need for scientific explanation has been conflated with the need for disabusing us of the delusion of feeling at home in the world. And I don't know that we need to feel that way, just for the very reason you said, that the constraints of our own knowing, of our own consciousness, are also the constraints which led to the emergence of the structure of the universe as it exists today. And so why
how
shouldn't
could how could it be otherwise?
yeah.
Um, and then it's very rational to conceive of those things a little bit poetically and romantically, but it's reasonable to think of them as benevolent, to think of them to think of ourselves as incredibly lucky, blessed, uh, because maybe and obviously the likelihood of you and I having this, like, if we are thinking in terms of these big landscapes of possibilities, of you and I having this conversation right now and whatever, is so vanishing. um we can only chalk it up to a certain kind of luck or felicity or ubity in a weird Persian term. And Peirce has this interesting essay that I've been discussing with another film recently on a neglected argument for the existence of God. And again, I don't necessarily think it has to be thought of in terms of that language. But I totally find that it's very reasonable language and very and sort of perennially available language for thinking about these things in terms of. But just to slightly jump, but within that essay, Peirce wants to talk about our faculty of abduction and our capacity to kind of, I guess, intuitively or without deducing or inducing, but nonetheless, I guess, infer, but for possible explanations of things to appear to us as if spontaneously in an improvised manner, but have a much better than random chance of being correct, or at least of being useful. And again, one, I think, should expect that if one's thinking about us as attuned to this, well, not just as attuned, but as products of, as co-evolved with this environment, which is on some degree of remove the entire history of cosmic evolution, at least of this epoch. So we're attuned to that. So we have faculties that are derived from that, embedded within that, etc. And they are, they have a propensity for resonating with that in certain ways.
Yeah.
Of course, we can also be deeply deluded. Um, um,
Yeah.
just to bring this up, because Peirce's Abduction is kind of a model of individuation.
Mm.
In a sort of Jungian sense, you have the eruption, or you have the transcendent function, right? You're met with a problem and you don't know how to resolve it, and you decide not to think about it anymore. And then while you're doing something else, a solution kind of just presents itself to you spontaneously. And this is very much related to, and not surprisingly, because Simondon certainly draws a lot on Jung, not unrelated to Simondon thinking about the eruption of some individual, some unique individuation from this pre-individual milieu of tensions, the sudden transition, where you get this. And so a number of our conversations ago, we very briefly talked, like just in passing, about Deleuze and Guattari and their sort of potential their notion of the body without organs, and the criticism maybe that they would have of something like the FEP in terms of if it's just these attractor states, how does it differ from itself? The same thing that we're talking about all the time. How do we get novelty? And one of our mutual friends on Twitter, I don't know if you noticed, he was commenting on a number of things that we said. This is Euanthes, and he had, was quite appreciative of a number of things we said, but then felt like we glossed over and didn't deal with the Deleuze and Guattari objection, because he wants to think of that objection. I mean, and they do, in fact, as a kind of non-evolutionary, as the need for a non-evolutionary account of the origins of novelty in a certain sense, right? And I think I take it by non-evolutionary here, we're meaning like non-cynic. Well, so Peirce's term would be cynicism, like continuity, but you could just think in terms of gradualism, right? So the need to invoke a kind of leap in a possibility space, or what Simondon would call an absolute origin.
Or what Whitehead would call the ingression of an eternal object.
Sure. And this is again something I've been talking about with Mike Levin a bit recently, in terms of, we can give a gradualist account, and you, Anthony, and others might not like this response. We can give a kind of gradualist account of these sorts of things, but there are also, Dennett would say, nature doesn't allow saltations, or natur non facet saltatio, right? So it's a hard gradualism. There are no leaps. It's all constructed in this step-by-step fashion in a certain sense. And that can be taken as, one of the key Darwinian views, assertion of a kind of gradualism. But of course, we know there's punctuated equilibrium. We know there are catastrophes. We know there are all these sorts of things. And at the molecular level, some of the things that I've studied are things that I think can really only be conceptualized as kind of leaps. And what am I trying to say? I'm just trying to say that there's a really, thinking about discreteness and continuity, as we have been a little bit, but thinking about origins of novelty in terms of this radical difference, this radical leap in possibility space, but that is nonetheless, now in terms of Peirce's abduction idea and his neglected argument, is nonetheless in conformity with something, broad,
Yeah, I mean, we need continuity for abduction to be possible, but there does also seem to be atomicity or discreteness, or these leaps, these decisions which occur, which cannot be explained, even in principle, by reference to what's come before. And that's part of what constitutes life, I mean, in Whitehead's scheme, at least, this capacity for mental originality, he would say. But I think, I'm glad you brought in abduction, because Peirce's account of that and the continuity it implies between our minds and nature, I think, is an example of what I was getting at earlier around this non-statistical basis for prediction, or a non-statistical basis for making judgments of probability, in that there is that continuity there. You don't need to calculate or hypothesize based on using Bayesian reasoning or something. It's a different kind of intuitive leap that implies this non-local connection, in a sense, between our local perspective and this ground of possibility, that would be something like Whitehead's extensive continuum. And what this would mean is that even if it's impossible to pre-state all of the possible functions, nonetheless, that computational impossibility would not be, on the old definition of computation, would not be a limit for this kind of abductive, an observer capable of abduction is not limited by the unprestatability of future functions, because there would be a intuitive link between the mental originality and that plenum of possibility by which all things are extensively connected to one another according to certain rules, and we can't state what those rules are. They're too general in a way. They're just too abstract for us to even wrap a concept around. But nonetheless, they're part of what structures our mind and part of what structures the world. And so judgments through abduction, I think, are an example of that connection. And it's a great term for what Whitehead calls non-statistical judgments of probability, because I think it really gets at the same ontological issues. It's too bad that Whitehead and Peirce couldn't get together and work through some of this stuff together. Whitehead would have needed to come to the US a lot earlier than he did.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, there are lots of great thinkers sort of passing like ships in the night. That would have been interesting to have them work through things together. I think one of the ways of thinking about these sort of abductive events is, again, this shift in context where something, so we think about acceptation maybe and there's a kind of leap in even though acceptation is it's a kind of a way of justifying within a gradualist framework a leap, a qualitative leap in a certain sense, because you've got something that's pre-existing, and either for, it might serve a particular function or it might have a purely arbitrary existence or whatever. And then when it comes into contact with something it doesn't have a history of contact with, it's suddenly a new possibility is created in that novel contact. So it is two things that have are both part of the continuum of the cosmos, but have been evolving in their separate ways, are not connected, don't have a real proximal or recent history of co-constraint, and then they interact with each other, and that creates a novel landscape of, again, constraint or enablement or whatever. And it's something of that nature, and it can be like a physical leap. Like we can look at a membrane-bound protein losing its transmembrane tail and becoming and acquiring a signal peptide, blah blah blah. But there's multiple steps here. But becoming a secretory protein, and suddenly it's got all of this structure that it evolved in association with some role that it had when it was membrane bound, except it's lost what actually made it membrane bound. And now that structure, pre-existing structure, goes out into this novel milieu of all these potential interaction partners, and in a kind of arbitrary way it sticks to things, because proteins are sticky and promiscuous in that way. But some relationship that it has, some novel relationship it has, kind of brings like a new quality into the world. Like there's a new way these things relate to each other and modulate each other, which is never seen and could not have been pre-stated in any sense, which is partly because there's a bunch of randomness or like arbitrariness involved.
right,
But it's an arbitrariness that's still, nested within a broader system of constraint, right?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase relevant novelty comes to mind to me here, where in every event which is occurring, in those cases where there's an observer, there's a sense of relevant novelty, and there's an initial aim there that's not determining what's going to happen, but there's, among those infinite possibilities or potentials that could be actualized, there's at least there's a constraint in place that makes some of them more relevant than others. And so that function, or it's kind of a meta function that all functions presuppose, is that there would be this initial aim there that grants relevant novelty. It's not determining, but it's limiting or constraining what might happen next in a way that makes it not just random.
It's definitely not just random. It may have a random or arbitrary element to it, but like a stochastic element to it. But the process as a whole of that new quality is no, it's not random. It's constrained. Like the random or arbitrary or whatever, that is the pure creative thing. It's arbitrarily jiggling or just dynamically changing. But then,
right.
Well,
that would always produce irrelevance, or almost always produce irrelevancies and not relevance.
and it produces a whole lot of irrelevance. And what, of course, what's salient or relevant to some may be irrelevant to others. But I'd say that we underestimate And comes back to this idea of benevolence or whatever, but the role of caprice as well in all of this. So you've got these different things going on here. You've got the pre-actualized, the pre-existent actualized that's stable at some temporal scale, right? And then you've got this rapid change thing that's happening, this stochastic element that's shaking things up and making possible new relations amongst pre-stabilized things, right? And so there's an arbitrary or a random, shaking, jiggling, moving, but that's going to be constrained by what is pre-existent. And then there's this element of caprice, which is what we invoke when something fortuitous happens within that landscape of possibility. Because a lot of things are irrelevant, like we have little thoughts all the time that probably don't lead anywhere, or are not useful to whatever the problematic we were engaging with might have been. But at the molecular level, you've got all sorts of things bumping into each other all the time and sticking to each other for a moment and unsticking and whatever, and most of that doesn't necessarily lead to anything. And that's maybe important because some of the constraint functions are ensuring that those sorts of random effects don't get out of hand, right? But every now and then you do get some kind of emergent novelty, and I think it's just maybe underappreciated even in sort of evolutionary biology and evolutionary thinking circles how much at some very, very pointy end we are reliant on this notion of caprice, like things have to come together at the right time in the right place, or kairos or whatever, for there to be a relevant novelty introduced into the world that has an opportunity of being stabilized. And then it could potentially be stabilized at different, timescales, right? Like, is it just stabilized developmentally in the lifetime of that individual, but then when that individual dies, it's gone? Or is there a mechanism at hand for, epigenetically stabilizing it, or stabilizing it through some kind of cultural transmission or whatever? Will it eventually be stabilized in the lineage in a way that, and a lot of these things have to come together in a certain way for lasting novelty to come into the world. But the thing is, it happens all the time as well. So, and that might seem like then we would need to invoke, the hand of some benevolent designer or whatever. But we can also invoke, and this also sounds disappointing in many ways, but there's a law of large numbers thing that has to just be brought into the discussion as well, because so much is happening all the time. Some small percentage of that can lead to, the ingression, I suppose, the concretization, concrescence of relevant novelty.
It would still need to be selectively amplified, right?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I gotta run. I gotta make dinner, but yeah, I mean, we're circling over a lot of ground we've covered before, but I feel like we're getting clearer on that the structure of the ideas and where to intervene in all of this. But we still got to get into fluidity and information, which
Yeah.
I'm eager to do. I think I can say next month. I have one more project I have to finish in the next week or so, but I think we can shift, if that's still the direction you want to go, shift into.
Yeah. I mean, so next month I'm traveling a lot, so we don't have that much opportunity for these chats. But I mean, I think with the fluidity stuff, maybe yeah, read the first couple of chapters of philosophy of information, and I think it's just an orienting, as we discussed, sort of orienting framework, and it's not necessarily. I don't know how rich it's going to be for us, but I think it's helpful for the insertion of what we're doing into a sort of contemporary landscape or contemporary discourse. I think a number of the other people that we're talking about, including Simondon, and his way of thinking about information specifically, because he is specifically grappling with information theory in probably a way that Whitehead isn't, because of the time scale, the time in which
Shannon's.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that can also be really orienting. And I think, I do think there's probably a series of, yeah, I'm certain there's a series of papers in this. And we can probably pursue something very close to the original plan of kind of focusing on Whitehead's theory of perception and working through Holism and the propositional stuff in process and reality. But a lot of the things that we are continually returning to in terms of, process, logic of actualization, generalization of the function, individuation in Simondon and Jung, maybe. It's always a question of whether you want to talk about Jung in this sort of context. Another thing we should do, which is kind of unrelated, but you'd still be a good person to talk to about it, is have a long chat about Jung's reception and the complexities there at some point. That'd be an interesting one to do, because I really do think he has something to say.
Me
and
too.
I also think his influence is slightly cryptic, and it's disseminated in such a way that I think about it in a funny way in relation to some of these French thinkers like Simondon, but certainly like Deleuze and Guattari, who, Grant Maxwell has obviously written about the influence of Jung on them, and they do talk about Jung. But it's funny how a lot of what they say in certain areas of what they're saying is quite Jungian, really. But because they're saying it in this kind of trendy, I mean, I love those guys, but there's a sort of trendy French way of saying it where Jung can be a bit heavy and turgid in the way that he's saying some of this stuff, like when he's engaging with myth and all of that. Yeah. People sometimes it hits in a certain way, and people are like, "Oh, I don't like that." Whereas when Deleuze and Guattari seem more playful, it's like, "Oh, this is totally okay. This is totally palatable."
Right. Yeah, I mean, Jung can come across as just in the way that he reacted to Freud as this overbearing father figure. Jung himself can take on the role of a patriarch in a sense, and even though, I mean, he's trying to redeem the feminine in all these ways, but just if you don't massage the idea of an archetype in the right way, it can very much start to feel like a pre-individuated Platonic form.
Definitely. And I mean, he's definitely flirting with that, but I think he is also a very evolutionary thinker. He doesn't necessarily go as far in, critiquing some of the essentialist, foundations, as he might. But there is that book, I'm pointing over there because it's over there somewhere. I can actually see it speaking out, but I can't see the title. But there's, what is it? Archetypal Process. That's what it's called.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I mean, but there's definitely a way that Jung can help us think individuation, basically, can help us think, clearly, but can help us think processes of actualization and logic of actualization in a specifically psychological content. And then the way he'll relate that to its archetypal, but, its depictions in lots of different mythological contexts. I think it's definitely useful stuff to think through.
Yeah. No, but there's a huge reception history problem with Jung. And, even in someone like today, Jordan Peterson, who's made Jung popular again, not that his popularity ever waned, but to a different audience, let's say. And I think Peterson tends to forget that Jung did describe archetypes as evolving. And so they start to sound more like essences, which probably has more to do with Peterson's politics than it does with Jung, to be honest. But it's an easy misreading to make, if you don't think through with Jung the way in which archetypes can be more like, they're collective habits in a sense, and they're subject to collective evolution.
And Jung's writing is so full of caution and hedging, and repeated references to the clinical context in which, and to his kind of bracketing of psychic reality and all of those sorts of things. And I do think that's often, even by those who lionize him, as well as by those who disregard him, a lot of that careful framing is ignored. And I think, it's unfortunate with someone like Peterson, who is such an unattractive figure for progressive intellectuals and has only become more so in the way that he's been, seemingly polarized by his, involvement in public, public intellectual life. It's in a way a shame, that he's so associated with Jung. I mean, even though, I mean, it's very clear that he's hugely influenced by Jung as well as, Nietzsche and others. And I wouldn't want to say that Peterson has nothing to say either. I think he's said a lot, and some of what he says makes sense. But yeah, there are big issues there as well, obviously.
Well, I look forward to diving into Jung with you. I was gifted the collected works that was from Stan Grof. It was part of his library when he moved back to Germany several years ago, and I'm eager to just really spend a lot of time revisiting Jung. I haven't read Jung for a while, but he was very formative for me, from 19 through the first half of my 20s. I just really was stewing in that and found such power in that mode of thought, personally and intellectually, so
Yeah, and I think that's one of these things that again makes it a bit of it can be a difficult thing to talk about publicly in a certain sense, because he does have a kind of not prophetic, but sort of, yeah. I mean, it's got a personal element to it, is what I'm trying to say. That very much touches on, of course, the religious.
and a transpersonal dimension to it too. Yeah.
100%, yeah, 100%. I mean, I wrote that paper from personal to transpersonal, which had a lot of Jung in it. Yeah, no, I think that would be a fun thing to do. I mean, it's another thing for us to discuss, but maybe you want to. I'm considering reading Answer to Job again in the near future. I have 2 copies of it, and one of them's really heavily annotated from one that I read it in the past and like scribbled all over it, and then one of them is like untouched. So I want to read it again, and I'll annotate it again, and then I want to compare my annotations and see if anything's changed. But I found that to be years and years ago just such a. I mean, Jung wrote a lot, and he repeats himself a ton, but he's got a lot of really interesting things to say, and there are little kernels in a lot of different works that are really, really fascinating. But Answer to Job's not that long, and it's a very potent distillation of a lot of different aspects of his thought. So that might be something to think about for a future chat.
No, I love that. I love that book. It's a very process oriented theology, I would say.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, okay, that sounds fun.
We could even take a little break, like a refresher from our chat. I mean, we'll keep working obviously in the background on the process FEP and everything stuff, but maybe next time we chat, it could be an Answer to Job chat.
Yeah, yeah,
Or
no, that'd be fun to change it up a little bit. Just get some fresh ideas flowing through the thought stream here.
Yeah, cool. Well,
Right.
let me know. Let me know when you want to do that. As I say, I'm away for a lot of May. We could probably meet once before I go. I'm
Okay.
going. I'm going on like the 7th, so it's in the next week. We have to meet in the next week, which might be too soon for an Answer to Job thing. But then yeah.
Let me check my calendar and see if I might be able to read it between now and then. But yeah, if not, I like the idea of switching gears a little bit.
Yeah, well, that could be, maybe the Answer to Job can be a June thing. We'll see if we have a catch up before May, and that could just be continuing developing these things, perhaps. And we could still really focus on some of the chemical ecology stuff if you want, where I think we can go through some biological examples and the way that I think that they actually do, can be illustrative of some of the processes that we're discussing. And then maybe in June we can do Answer to Job. It gives us plenty of time to read it and marinate in it.
Yeah. Okay.
Man.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Always fun, Tim.
Absolutely. Great pleasure.
Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll talk to you
Yep.
soon.
And see ya.